Winter, 1867. A lonely log cabin at the foot of White Wolf Peak, Montana Territory. Blood was dripping from Levi's arm onto the floorboards. The broken glass was still in the girl's hand. "Stay back, don't you come near." "Me?" Elara pressed herself into the corner, her voice cracking, her whole body trembling like a candle in a storm. Levi looked down at the gash on his forearm, then looked back at her. No anger, no punishment, just a gentleness so unfamiliar it didn't seem real. "You were protecting yourself," he said, low and steady. "That's all that happened here. Don't you carry 1 ounce of guilt over it." Then Gideon, quiet, unhurried, walked to the hearth, picked up a piece of charred wood, and drew a single black line across the floor in front of her. 10 inches. No more. "That's your line," he said, River Ice eyes holding hers. "None of us cross it, not tonight. Not ever, unless you say so." Elara Vance had crossed half a continent to escape one man. Tonight, she stood facing 3 strangers, and not one of them had come to take anything from her. So, what did they want? And what was waiting on the other side of that thin charcoal mark? The story starts now, and trust me, you're not going to want to stop here. The train pulled away behind her, hissing steam into the cold morning air, and then it was gone. Just smoke and silence, and the sound of wind moving through pine trees she had never seen before. Elara Vance stood alone on a wooden platform that barely deserved the name. 1 bench, 1 lantern, unlit, a battered carpetbag at her feet, holding everything she owned in the world. She was 20 years old. She had crossed half a continent, and she had never been so afraid in her life. Back east, fear had a shape. It wore her uncle's face. It lived behind locked doors and polite smiles that meant nothing kind at all. Out here, fear had no shape yet. That was worse. Somehow, she didn't know what to brace for. The letter in her coat pocket had promised an older man. A widower, the matchmaker said, steady, quiet, someone safe enough to disappear beside, in a place far enough away that her uncle's money couldn't follow her. That was the plan. Vanish, start over as nobody. 3 shapes came around the side of the depot building, and the plan fell apart in her chest. They were not old men. They were not widowers. They were 3 of the largest men Elara had ever seen, broad through the shoulders, dressed in worn leather and wool, moving the way mountains might move if mountains decided to walk. She took a step back before she could stop herself. The tallest one pulled off his hat. Dark hair, a scar through one eyebrow, eyes the color of river ice. "Miss Vance," he said, "I'm Gideon Cross. These are my brothers, Levi and Caleb." Brothers, plural. Her mind tried to make sense of the word and failed. The middle one, broad as a barn door, but soft around the eyes, gave her a small nod. "Ma'am," he said quietly. The third, younger, leaner, stayed back near the wagon and said nothing at all. He just watched her the way a man watches weather rolling in. 3 of them. Not one. Elara's pulse climbed into her throat. Every story she had ever heard about the frontier, every warning her uncle's lawyers had whispered to frighten her into staying, came rushing back at once. Lawless land. No witnesses, no one to hear a woman scream. She had traded one cage for a darker one. That was all this was. She could see it now, clear as the cold air. "There's been some mistake," she managed. Her voice came out thin. "I was told, I was promised. 1 man, a widower." Gideon's expression didn't shift into anger. If anything, it gentled. "No mistake, Miss Vance. The letter should have said all 3 of us run the ranch together. Maybe it didn't say it plain enough. I'm sorry for that. Sorry." He'd said sorry. Her uncle had never once said that word to her and meant it. Still, her hands shook at her sides. 3 strangers, 3 times the danger. Her frightened mind insisted, no matter how calm his voice sounded. Levi stepped forward, slow, the way a man might approach a spooked horse. "You don't have to decide anything today," he said. "Just the ride home. That's all we're asking. Dry bed. Nothing more than that." Caleb still hadn't moved from the wagon. He hadn't said a word, but his eyes flicked once toward his brothers, then back to her, and something in that quiet steadiness almost, loosened the knot behind her ribs. almost wasn't enough. Not yet. Elara looked past them at the empty platform. The empty tracks. The white peaks rising up behind the little town like a wall she could never climb back over. There was no train coming for hours. There was nowhere else to go. She had spent every last coin she had to get this far. She was trapped here, just as surely as she'd been trapped in her uncle's house. Only this time, the bars were made of mountains instead of money. I don't have a choice, she said softly. Not to them, to herself. Gideon heard it anyway. Something passed behind his eyes, quick and sad, like he understood exactly what those words cost a person to say out loud. You've got more choice than you think, Miss Vance, he said. Starting right now. You can walk to that wagon on your own 2 feet, or we'll wait here as long as you need. We've got nowhere else to be today. It wasn't what she expected. None of this was what she expected. Slowly, because her legs would not do anything quickly, Elara bent down and picked up her carpet bag. Her fingers were white around the handle. She walked toward the wagon the way a person walks toward deep water. Careful, bracing, not at all sure the ground would hold. Behind her, the mountains watched in silence, indifferent to whether she lived or drowned. Ahead of her, 3 strangers waited, patient as the snow on the peaks, in no hurry at all. She did not know yet that patience was the first promise they would keep. The ranch house sat low against the mountainside, log walls dark with age, smoke curling steady from the chimney. It looked sturdier than anything Elara had lived in for years. That should have comforted her. It didn't. Supper passed in near silence. Levi had made a stew thick with potatoes and venison, and it was good, better than good, but Elara barely tasted it. She kept her eyes on her bowl and her body angled toward the door, the way a person sits when they are already planning how fast they could run if running became necessary. Gideon noticed. He noticed most things, but he didn't say anything yet. He had learned, somewhere in 4 years of war, that frightened creatures don't need more words thrown at them. They need time. When the meal ended, Caleb showed her up to the attic room, the only space in the house, with a door that closed all the way and a latch on the inside. Small mercy, that latch. Elara gripped it like a lifeline the moment he stepped back down the stairs. The room was simple, a narrow bed, a washstand, a single window, frosted at the edges. Moonlight bleeding through in pale streaks. It was cold enough that her breath showed in front of her face. She heard boots on the stairs. Her whole body locked up before her mind even caught up to why. 3 knocks, gentle ones. Gideon's voice came through the wood. Miss Vance, it's just us. The fire's low up here. We wanted to bring more wood before it gets colder. Logical, reasonable, kind even. None of that mattered to the part of her that had spent years learning what came after a door opened in the dark. Her uncle's house had taught her that lesson early, and taught it well. Footsteps in the hallway at night never meant anything good. The latch clicked. The door swung open. 3 shapes filled the frame, broad shoulders blocking the hall light behind them. And something inside Elara simply broke loose from its mooring. She didn't decide to scramble backward. Her body did it for her, knees hitting the corner where the wall met the washstand, knocking the small mirror there to the floor. Glass shattered against the boards. Her hand found a long, jagged piece before her mind caught up to what her hand was doing. Stay back, she said, and her voice didn't sound like her own. It sounded like a stranger's, thin and cracking. Stay back, stay back. Don't you come near me. Levi was the closest. Big, soft-spoken Levi, who had spent the whole walk up the stairs thinking about how cold that little room must be. He took 1 step forward, hand raised, palm open, the universal gesture, for I mean no harm. Easy now, he said softly. Nobody's gonna. She slashed at him. It wasn't aimed, not really. It was the blind swing of someone fighting a memory more than a man. But Levi was close enough that the glass caught his forearm anyway. A shallow line opening across the skin. Blood welled up dark and quick, dripping onto the floorboards between them. 3 small red drops against pale wood. Levi didn't cry out. He didn't even flinch much. He just looked down at his arm, then back up at her shaking form, pressed into the corner. And something in his broad face softened instead of hardened. It's all right, he murmured. more to himself than to her, already stepping back, giving her room. It's all right. I'm fine. Caleb's jaw had tightened. Every instinct in him coiled toward action, but he held himself still in the doorway. He had learned patience from animals long before he learned it from people. And right now, patience was the only thing that would help. It was Gideon who moved. He didn't rush her. He didn't raise his voice. He crossed slowly to the hearth, crouched, and pulled a blackened piece of charred wood from the edge of the fire, something cool enough on one end to hold. Then, in full view of her, moving with the unhurried care of a man, diffusing something far more dangerous than it looked, he knelt on the floorboards and drew a single thick black line across the wood. He measured the distance with his eyes first, then with his hand, fingers spread wide, walking the span out twice, roughly 10 inches from where her trembling feet were pressed against the wall. Then he sat back on his heels, on his side of the line, and looked up at her. There, he said quietly. That's as close as any of us come tonight, or any night, unless you say otherwise. Elara's breathing was still ragged, the glass still clutched in her white-knuckled fist. But something in his stillness was beginning to cut through the fog of panic. You're not going to come closer than that, he went on, voice low and even, the way a man might talk to a spooked colt. Not me, not Levy, not Caleb. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not next winter. That line stays right there until you decide, yourself, that it doesn't need to. Why, she whispered. It wasn't really a question. It was disbelief given a single syllable. Gideon held her gaze. Because you're shaking like the world's about to end. And, somewhere along the way, somebody taught you that men coming through a door means something bad's about to happen to you. We can't undo what was done before we ever met you, but we can promise you what happens under this roof. He glanced once at Levi's arm, the blood still beating along the cut, then back at her, and there was no anger in his face at all, only a kind of grave steadiness. We'll all give you 10 inches tonight, he said, and every night after. That's a boundary, plain and simple. Nobody crosses it without you saying, it's all right. Your body belongs to you, Miss Vance. Not to us, not to your uncle, not to anybody who ever told you otherwise. Consent is the only law that matters in this house. The room was very quiet after that. Just the fire ticking in the hearth, and the wind outside the frosted window, and Elara's own ragged breath slowing, 1 inch at a time, toward something steadier. Her gaze dropped to the glass still in her hand, to the cut on Levi's arm, to the careful black line on the floor. Drawn not to trap her, but to set her free of a fear 3 strangers had no part in causing. I hurt you, she said to Levi, voice cracking. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean. I didn't know who you didn't hurt me, Levi said gently. And he meant it the way a man means a thing he has already decided is true and is not going to argue about. You protected yourself. That's all that happened here. Don't you carry 1 ounce of guilt over that? Caleb finally spoke from the doorway, quiet as ever. We'll get that wood stacked from out here, he said. Won't even need to step past Gideon's line. You rest easy, Miss Vance. True to his word, he passed the logs hand to hand from the hallway, Gideon receiving them and building the fire back up himself, never once crossing the charcoal mark. Levi wrapped a strip of cloth around his own arm with the practiced ease of a man who had bandaged plenty of frightened, injured animals in his time, human or otherwise. When the fire was crackling steady again, the 3 brothers withdrew to the doorway. Latch the door if it helps you sleep, Gideon said. We won't take it personal. Tomorrow's another day, and there's no rush on any of it. The door clicked shut. Boots receded down the stairs. Elara sat for a long while in the corner, the broken glass finally set aside, her eyes fixed on that thick black line on the floor. 10 inches, a small distance, and yet it felt in that moment like the first real wall she had ever seen, built specifically to protect her, instead of to cage her. For years, every door in her life had opened onto danger. Tonight, for the first time she could remember, a door had opened and then simply, quietly stopped. She did not sleep easily, but she slept eventually. And when she woke the next morning, the charcoal line was still there, untouched, exactly where Gideon had drawn it. Elara woke before dawn, the way she had been trained to. Back east, A lady's maid who slept past the household's needs found herself replaced, or worse, lectured by an uncle who measured a person's worth by how invisible they could make themselves. Old habits did not care that she had crossed a continent to escape them. She crept down the narrow stairs in the gray half-light, careful to step over the spots that creaked, and found the kitchen empty. Good, that gave her time. By the time Gideon, Levi, and Caleb came down for breakfast, she had the table set, biscuits browning in the cast-iron skillet, coffee already boiling on the stove. She stood off to the side near the wall, hands folded, eyes down, the posture of a servant waiting to be told she had done something wrong. The brothers stopped in the doorway, all three at once, and for a moment nobody said anything at all. "Miss Vance," Levi said carefully, "did you make all this?" "Yes," she said. "I hope it's satisfactory. I can do better tomorrow if it isn't." Something crossed Levi's broad, gentle face, something that looked almost like sadness. He had grown up around plenty of hard-working women, his own mother chief among them. But he had never once seen a woman stand against a wall like that, flinching slightly, bracing for criticism before anyone had even sat down to eat. "It smells wonderful," Caleb said, pulling out a chair, trying to ease the tension the only way he knew how, with simple honesty. "Come sit. We'll all eat together. I'll eat after," Elara said quickly, "once you've all had your fill. There's not quite enough for 4. I didn't want to presume on the portions." That stopped Levi cold. Fork halfway to a plate he hadn't even filled yet. "Not enough for 4, he repeated slowly. "You made enough for 3 grown ranchers and skipped your own plate to do it." "It's only fitting," Elara said, and there was no self-pity in her voice, only a flat, practiced certainty. The kind that comes from years of being told the same lesson until it stops feeling like a lesson and starts feeling like the truth. "I'm a guest under your roof. I should be useful, not a burden." Gideon's jaw tightened, just slightly. The same controlled stillness he'd worn the night before, with the charcoal line. But it was Levi who set his fork down, stood, and crossed the kitchen toward her, slow and unhurried, the way he always moved. He didn't cross the invisible boundary they had drawn the night before. He simply held out his hand, palm up, and nodded toward the skillet she still held against her side like a shield. "Give me that," he said gently. "It's no trouble, I promise." I know you can," Levi said. "That's not the question. The question is whether you should have to, every single meal, for the rest of your life under this roof." And the answer to that is no. She hesitated, and in that hesitation he simply reached out, careful, slow, and took the skillet handle from her fingers. "Sit," he said, nodding to the chair at the head of the table, the one with the best view of the window. The one any of the 3 brothers usually claimed without a second thought. "Right there. That's your seat." "It's a chair," Levi said, the corner of his mouth tugging upward. "Chairs don't belong to anybody in particular." "Sit," she sat, slowly, like she expected the floor to give way beneath her. But she sat. Gideon and Caleb exchanged a glance over the table, the kind of glance brothers share when they both understand something without needing to say it aloud. Then, without comment, they began serving themselves, and serving her too, setting a full plate down in front of her with the same unhurried care Levi had used on the skillet. "You'll eat first today," Gideon said simply, "and every day we'll take turns figuring out who eats when. Same as we always have. You're not a servant here, Miss Vance. You're a person living under this roof, same as the rest of us, and persons eat." Breakfast passed quieter than usual, but it was a different kind of quiet than the night before. Less fear in it, more careful, watchful curiosity, on her part of 3 men eating beside her instead of above her. After the plates were cleared, Levi didn't let her near the wash basin either. "I'll teach you something instead," he said, already pulling flour down from the shelf. "Sourdough takes patience, and you've got that in spades from what I can already tell." "You want to teach me to bake," she said, half disbelieving. "Don't you have a starter your mother left you? Something precious you wouldn't want ruined by clumsy hands." "I've got a starter," Levi agreed, setting the crock down on the table between them. "And I've got 2 hands that already know how to use it. What I don't have is anybody to share the kitchen with most days." Caleb burns water. Gideon's hopeless past frying bacon. A man gets lonely cooking alone for 30 years, even when he likes the work. That earned the first real laugh she'd let slip since the train platform. Quick and startled, like it had escaped before she remembered to stop it. There it is, Levy said, smiling. Knew you had one in there, somewhere. He walked her through the starter, slow and patient, showing her how to feed it, how to judge it by smell and by feel, rather than by some fixed rule written in a book. His hands were enormous, scarred from animal work, gentle as anything, when he guided hers over the dough. My mother used to say, bread teaches a person patience, he told her, kneading alongside her at the table, shoulder to shoulder. No boundary needed between them, because none had ever felt necessary with Levi. You can't rush it, can't force it to rise faster than it wants to. You just give it time and warmth, and trust that it knows what it's doing. Sounds like more than bread advice, Elara said quietly, working the dough beneath her palms. Might be, Levi allowed, doesn't make it less true either way. By mid-morning, the kitchen smelled of yeast and wood smoke, flour dusting both their forearms, and Elara found, somewhat to her own astonishment, that her shoulders had unknotted themselves without her noticing exactly when. Gideon passed through twice that morning, checking on chores, and both times he found the same scene. A woman who had arrived flinching at shadows, now elbow deep in dough beside his brother, listening with real attention. As Levi explained the difference between a starter that was hungry and one that was simply resting. Nobody had told her to cook. Nobody had told her she couldn't, either. That, Gideon thought, watching from the doorway a moment before moving on to the barn, might turn out to be the whole difference between her uncle's house and this one. Not grand speeches, not dramatic rescues, just an empty chair at the head of a table, and a skillet handed back without a single word of permission required. By evening, when the first loaf came golden and fragrant from the hearth, Elara cut it herself, 4 even slices, and set one in front of each brother before taking her own seat at the table without being told to. Nobody flinched. Nobody objected. It was in its quiet way. The first thing in years that had felt entirely like her own choice. The axe was heavier than Elara expected. She hadn't anticipated that. Somehow, it looked simple enough leaning against the wood pile. Just a long handle and a blade. And yet, the moment she hefted it off the ground, her arms understood immediately how much she had underestimated the thing. She'd chosen the task herself. That was the important part. Nobody had asked her to chop wood. She had walked out to the pile that afternoon while the brothers were off mending fence, determined to prove, mostly to herself, that she could be more than a frightened woman who needed bread baked for her and meals handed to her like charity. The first swing went wide and clipped the edge of the log, sending it skittering off the chopping block entirely. The second connected, barely, with a glancing blow that did nothing but jar her wrists. The third swing, the one that nearly ended badly, came down at an angle steep enough to send the blade skipping sideways toward her own boot, missing by a margin that made her heart lurch up into her throat. She froze there, axe head buried in the dirt inches from her foot, breathing hard, more shaken by what almost happened than by the actual swing itself. You're holding it like it owes you money. The voice came from the tree line, quiet, unhurried. Caleb stepped out from the shadow of the pines, where he'd apparently been standing for some time, watching, saying nothing until now. Elara straightened fast, embarrassment flooding her cheeks. I didn't realize anyone was watching. Wasn't planning to say anything, Caleb admitted, until you near took your own foot off. Figured that was worth a word or two. He didn't come closer. He stayed exactly where he was at the edge of the clearing, well outside any boundary anybody had ever needed to draw for him. The kind of careful distance that came as naturally to Caleb as breathing. I don't actually know what I'm doing, Elara admitted, setting the axe down. Suddenly, feeling foolish standing there with her hair coming loose from its pins and dirt on her skirt. Most folks don't, first time, Caleb said. Nobody's born knowing how to split a log clean. Mind if I tell you a few things from right here? Won't come any closer unless you ask me to. She glanced at him, surprised by the offer, by the careful way He'd phrased it, leaving the choice entirely in her hands, the way his brothers always seemed to. All right, she said. Tell me. Pick the axe back up, he said. Not by the very end of the handle. Slide your top hand down a touch. There, that's it. Now your feet. You're standing square to the log, like you're facing a person you mean to argue with. Turn your hip out instead. Sideways stance, like you're about to take a step. Not throw a punch, Elara adjusted. Feeling clumsy, very aware of her own body, in a way she usually tried hard not to be. Good, Caleb said. Now don't swing from your shoulders. That's where most folks go wrong, including plenty of men twice your size. Let your hips lead it. The axe head's heavy enough to do the work on its own. You're just aiming it and letting gravity finish the job. She swung again, slower this time, feeling the difference in her hips, rather than straining in her arms. And the blade bit into the log with a satisfying thunk, though it didn't split clean through. Better, Caleb said. You're fighting the log instead of trusting the swing. Try once more, same stance. Let your weight follow the blade down, instead of holding back at the last second. Elara breathed out slow, set her feet the way he'd shown her, and swung the log split clean in two, both halves toppling off the chopping block. And for a moment, she just stood there, staring at it, axe still raised slightly, as if she didn't quite believe her own arms had done that. A laugh broke out of her, real and surprised, the kind that came up from somewhere she hadn't visited in years. I did it, Caleb agreed, and there was a quiet warmth in his voice. No surprise in it at all, like he'd known the whole time it was only a matter of swings before she got there. Set another one up. You've got the feel of it now. She split 3 more logs before her arms started trembling with the effort, sweat beading at her hairline, despite the cool mountain air. And each time the wood gave way beneath her, swing something in her chest loosened a little further. My uncle used to say a lady's hands were for needlework and nothing else, she said, mostly to herself. Setting up another log, said calluses ruined a woman's prospects. Calluses just mean you've done something worth doing, Caleb said simply. Don't see how that ruins anybody. He'd have had a fit, seeing me like this. Then it's a good thing he's not here to see it, Caleb said, and there was no malice in it. Just plain fact, stated the way he stated most things. She paused, axe resting against her shoulder, and looked over at him, standing patient at the tree line, never once stepping closer than was asked of him. Doesn't it bother you, she said slowly, having a woman out here doing this kind of work? Most men I've known would say it makes them look weak, letting a wife or a ward handle an axe. Caleb considered that for a moment, the way he considered most things, slow and unhurried. You don't need to be weak for us to feel like men, he said finally. Never made sense to me, that notion. Your strength doesn't threaten anybody here. If anything, it protects you, same as it protect any of us. World's hard enough on its own without a person pretending to be smaller than they are, just to make somebody else comfortable. Don't ever apologize for being strong. Miss Vance, not in front of me, not in front of my brothers, not in front of anybody. Elara looked down at her own hands, red from the axe handle, a blister already forming at the base of her thumb, and felt something unfamiliar settle into her chest. Not just pride, though. There was plenty of that. Something steadier than pride. Permission, maybe, though she was only beginning to understand that the permission had been hers all along, simply waiting for someone to remind her of it. Show me again, she said, resetting her stance. I want to get the angle right without thinking about it. Caleb nodded once, settling back against a pine trunk, patient as the mountain itself. Hips lead, he said. Let the axe do its job. You've already got the rest. By the time the sun dipped low behind White Wolf Peak, painting the snow gold and rose, a small stack of split logs sat neatly beside the chopping block, more wood than Elara had ever imagined her own 2 arms capable of producing. She stood back, surveying the pile, sweat cooling on her skin, breath coming easy for what felt like the first time in years. The sound of the axe striking true, she thought. Watching the last log split clean in front of her was not a violent sound at all. It sounded, more than anything, like freedom. The storm came down off the peak without much warning, the way mountain storms tended to. 1 hour the sky was a hard, clear blue, and the next a wall of gray had swallowed White Wolf Peak whole. Snow coming sideways thick enough to blind a person 10 feet from their own front porch. Gideon had seen the signs early, the particular stillness in the air, the way the horses had gone restless in the barn that morning. And he'd had the brothers haul in extra wood and check the stock twice before the first flakes even started falling. By nightfall, the cabin groaned under wind that seemed determined to peel the roof off, and nobody was going anywhere until it passed. Elara sat near the hearth, a quilt around her shoulders, watching the fire instead of the storm she couldn't see anyway. 3 months in this house had changed something in how she held herself. Her shoulders no longer crept up toward her ears every time a door opened. She still kept careful track of where each brother stood in a room. Old habits didn't disappear, just because new ones had started growing over them. But the watching had softened into something closer to simple awareness than outright fear. Levi had gone up early, exhausted from wrestling a stubborn heifer through the worst of the wind. Caleb sat by the window, tracking the storm's temper the way he tracked everything, quiet and attentive. That left Gideon across the hearth from her, mending a bridle strap by firelight. His sleeves rolled to the elbow. She had noticed the scars before. It was hard not to, working alongside a man for months. Sleeves rolled up against the heat of a stove or the work of a barn. Long pale lines across his forearm. A deeper one, tracking down from his shoulder. The kind that didn't come from any ranch accident. "You were a soldier," she said quietly. Not really a question. Gideon's hands paused on the leather, just for a moment before continuing their slow, careful work. 4 years, he said, Union Army. Started at 19, came home at 23, feeling about 60. Why did you go? He considered the question longer than she expected, the fire popping softly between them, wind howling its argument against the walls outside. My father used to say, a man who watches another man get treated like property and does nothing has already decided what kind of man he is. Gideon said finally, I didn't want to be that kind of man, so I went. That's a heavy thing to carry at 19. Heavier to carry the alternative, he said. Watching it happen and telling yourself it isn't your business. That's its own kind of wound, the kind that doesn't show up on the skin. He set the bridle down, looking into the fire now, instead of at his work. I saw things in those 4 years I still don't talk about easy, but I never once doubted why I was there. That part stayed clear the whole time. Even when everything else went dark, Elara pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders, watching the firelight move across the old scars on his arm. Does it still hurt, the wounds? I mean, some nights more than others, Gideon admitted. Cold makes the old ones ache. Storms worse than most. He glanced at her, something gentler crossing his face. Doesn't compare to what you carry, though I chose my fight. Walked into it with my eyes open. You didn't choose what was done to you. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, the wind seemed, for a moment, to hold its breath. Elara found herself speaking before she fully decided to. Maybe it was the storm, the sense of being sealed away from the rest of the world for a few hours. Maybe it was simply that Gideon had handed her his own truth first, unguarded, and something in her wanted to meet that honesty with her own. My name isn't really just Elara Vance, ward of nobody fleeing a bad arrangement, she said slowly. I'm the only legal heir to my father's shipping company, the Vance Atlantic Line. You may have heard of it, even out here. Gideon's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he said nothing, letting her continue at her own pace. My parents died when I was 12. Fever, both of them within a week of each other. My uncle Sterling became my guardian, and with that, controller of the entire estate until I turned 25 or married, whichever came first. Her hands twisted in the quilt's edge. He didn't want either of those things to happen on terms he didn't control. A married niece with a husband asking questions about the books was a problem. An institutionalized niece, declared unfit to manage her own affairs, was not institutionalized. Gideon repeated the word coming out low and hard. He'd already begun the paperwork, bribed a doctor to declare me prone to hysteria, unstable, a danger to myself. Once that document was signed, I'd have disappeared into an asylum with no one left to ask why, and the company, and everything in it, would have passed entirely into his hands. Her voice trembled, but she kept going, like a dam that had decided, finally, to let the water through. I overheard him discussing the arrangements with his lawyer. I had perhaps 2 days before the doctor's signature made it official. So I ran. Took what cash I could carry. Found a mail-order matchmaking service with no connection to my family's circles, and came as far west as the money would take me. The room was very quiet. Even the storm outside seemed to have settled into the background, a dull roar rather than a howl. You didn't come here to vanish into an ordinary life, Gideon said slowly, putting the pieces together aloud. You came here because it was the only door left that your uncle's money couldn't reach. Yes, and you've been waiting this whole time for him to find that door anyway. She nodded, throat tight. He has resources, Mr. Cross. Lawyers, hired men, a great deal of money, and very little conscience about how he spends it. I didn't want to bring that danger into your home. I should have told you sooner. I should have told all of you, the very first night. Gideon set the mended bridle aside entirely now, leather forgotten, his full attention on her. You told us when you were ready, he said. That's the only timing that ever mattered. Aren't you angry? I put your family at risk without your knowledge. Any man who looks at another human being and sees property instead of a person is a man who's already lost his soul, Gideon said, the words coming out steady, certain, the kind of certainty that had clearly been forged a long time before tonight. Your uncle saw a company and an inheritance walking around in the shape of a girl he was supposed to protect. That's not a misunderstanding, Miss Vance. That's exactly the kind of evil I've put on a uniform to fight against once already. His jaw set, firelight catching the old scar along his brow. If he comes here looking to drag you back into that, he'll find 3 men standing between him and you who already know how to fight, and who already decided a long time ago what kind of men we mean to be. Elara's eyes burned, and she didn't try to hide it this time. Didn't duck her head or apologize for the tears the way she might have months ago. Why would you risk that for me? You barely know me. I know enough, Gideon said simply. I know you fed 3 strangers before you fed yourself. The first morning you woke up in this house. Because somebody taught you your needs came last. I know you learned to swing an axe, rather than ask anybody to do hard things for you. I know you cried over a stranger's cut arm before you ever worried about your own safety. He held her gaze, steady as the hearth fire between them. A person's character shows itself plain enough, given a little time. Yours showed itself plenty already. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, something had shifted, quiet and permanent, the way ice shifts deep in a river long before the surface ever cracks. Thank you, Elara whispered, for telling me about the war, for trusting me with that. Trust runs both directions, Gideon said. You just proved that plain enough yourself. Tonight, they sat together by the fire a while longer, the storm slowly losing its temper outside. And for the first time since the train platform, Elara felt something other than fear settle into the space around her. Not yet safety, not entirely, but the beginning of it, certainly. The first real brick laid in a wall built to keep her safe, instead of to keep her caged. The blizzard broke by morning, leaving behind a world scrubbed white and startlingly bright. Sunlight bouncing hard off 3 feet of new snow. The brothers spent the day digging paths between the house and the barn, checking on stock that had weathered the storm in various states of distress. It was Caleb who noticed the calf missing, a young one, barely 4 months old, separated somehow from its mother during the worst of the wind, likely spooked into the tree line before the snow had buried every familiar landmark. I'll find her, Elara said, already reaching for her coat. Caleb frowned. Storms passed, but the drifts out past the tree line are deep enough to swallow a horse. I should go. You're needed here, repairing the fence line before more stock wanders off, Elara said. I know that calf's markings. I've fed her by hand every morning for 2 weeks. Let me look. I'll stay close to the ridge trail. I won't go past it. It was, in hindsight, exactly the kind of promise that mountains rarely allowed people to keep. She found the calf an hour later, bawling pitifully in a stand of pines, well past where she had meant to stop, snow up past her own knees, the cold already working its way past her coat and into her bones. She was coaxing the animal free of a drift when the world above her let go. It wasn't a roar, not really, not the way she might have imagined an avalanche sounding. It was more like the mountain exhaling, a deep low groan, and then everything was moving at once. Snow and rock and the sound of trees snapping like kindling. Elara grabbed the calf and ran, instinct alone driving her legs, and the world went white and deafening around her. When it stopped, she was buried to the waist, lungs heaving, ears ringing in the strange muffled silence that follows a slide. The calf had bolted free somewhere in the chaos, and for a moment she thought she was entirely alone out here, half buried, snow packed hard around her legs. Then she heard the voice. Elara. Caleb had followed her tracks the moment she'd been gone longer than he liked the look of, some instinct of his own refusing to settle. He found her struggling against the packed snow, and together, they fought their way toward what looked like shelter, a shallow cave mouth in the rock face nearby, half collapsed but still holding. They made it inside just as a second smaller slide thundered down behind them, sealing off most of the entrance with snow and broken rock, leaving only a narrow gap for air and a sliver of gray daylight. It was Caleb who had taken the worst of it. A falling branch, dislodged by the first slide, had caught him across the ribs as they scrambled for shelter. And now, in the dim cold light of the cave, Elara could see him favoring his side badly, his breathing already going shallow and uneven. "You're hurt?" she said, kneeling beside him. "I'll manage," Caleb said, though his voice had a flatness to it that worried her more than any complaint would have. Within the hour, that flatness had turned to something worse. His words slowed, his shivering, violent at first, began to ease in a way that should have comforted her, and instead terrified her completely. She had heard Levi describe this once, treating a half-frozen calf pulled from an icy creek. The body stops fighting the cold right before the cold wins entirely. "Caleb." She shook his shoulder. "Hard, Caleb, stay awake." "Talk to me cold," he murmured, eyes drifting half shut, tired. "You don't get to be tired right now," she said, fear sharpening her voice into something fierce. "Caleb Cross, you look at me." His eyes opened, barely, finding hers in the gray light. She knew with sudden clarity exactly what needed to happen, and exactly what it would cost her to do it. Every instinct she'd spent years building, every wall constructed brick by brick against the danger of a man's body close to her own, stood directly between her and the only thing that might save his life. She thought of the charcoal line on the attic floor, 10 inches, drawn not as a cage but as a promise, a boundary that existed entirely for her to cross or not cross, on her own terms, whenever she decided the time had come. This was that moment, not because anyone demanded it of her, because she chose it. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not entirely sure who she was apologizing to. The version of herself that had built those walls, or the version of Caleb who would have apologized himself if he'd had the strength left to argue. "I have to," she moved close, wrapping both arms around him, pressing the length of her body against his to share whatever warmth she had left to give. Her cheek against his chest, where she could feel his heartbeat, slower than she liked, but steady. There was nothing in the touch but urgency and care. No fear left in it at all. Strange as that realization was even as she registered it. This was not a man's hands closing around her in the dark, taking something she hadn't offered. This was her own arms, her own choice, given freely to keep someone alive. "Stay with me," she murmured against his chest, rubbing warmth into his arms, his back, anything to keep his blood moving, his mind present. "Tell me something. Anything. Just keep talking." "Used to track elk with my pa," Caleb mumbled, voice slurred but present. Present enough. "Up past the ridge. Took me 3 winters before I could read a trail proper." "Keep going," she said, holding him tighter. He did, drifting in and out. Stories of childhood winters and his father's patient teaching. And she held on through all of it, refusing to let the cold win, refusing to let go even as her own arms ached and her own teeth chattered against the dropping temperature inside the cave. It was nearly dark when Gideon and Levi finally found them, having tracked the slide and then their footprints, with a single-minded urgency that had carried them through deep snow at a pace that should have exhausted lesser men entirely. They dug through the narrow opening, calling names, and found Elara still wrapped around Caleb, both of them cold and exhausted, but both of them against every fear that had driven the brothers through the snow. "Alive, hurt," Elara said immediately, voice raw. "His ribs and the cold, he needs warmth." Now Levi was already moving, checking Caleb's pulse, his breathing, the careful, competent motions of a man who had spent years pulling animals back from the edge of death and refused to lose his own brother to the same cold that had nearly claimed plenty of calves and colts before. They carried Caleb out between them, Gideon supporting Elara's own shaking steps through the snow, and the walk back to the cabin passed in a blur of cold and worry, and the desperate hope that they would be in time. By the fire that night, Caleb wrapped in every blanket the house owned, color slowly returning to his face. Levi looked across at Elara with something like wonder in his expression. "You held him through that," he said, "skin to skin that long, in that cold. Most folks panic clean through a thing like that." "I was afraid," Elara admitted. Her own hands still not entirely steady around the cup of tea, Levi had pressed into them. "I've never been more afraid of touching another person in my life, and you did it anyway," Gideon said quietly from across the room, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name yet, though it would take her very little time to learn its shape. "He needed it," she said simply. Fear didn't get a vote, not this time. Healing, she was beginning to understand, was rarely a straight road. It curved back on itself, doubled over old fears at unexpected moments, asked impossible things of a person at the worst possible time. But it could also, apparently, deliver a person straight through the heart of an old fear and out the other side, stronger for having walked through rather than around it. Caleb's eyes opened slightly from his nest of blankets, finding her across the fire-lit room. "Thank you," he managed, voice still rough but steady enough now to carry real weight. "Don't think I'd have made it through that cave without you. Don't think I'd have wanted to try," Elara said, and meant every word of it. Springs arrived slow and stubborn, snow retreating from the valley floor in patches, the first green pushing up wherever the sun lingered longest. Elara had begun to believe, cautiously, that the life she'd built here might actually hold. She was wrong about how long it would take her past to find her. The riders came up the main trail on a clear morning in early May. 6 of them, dressed too fine for ranch country. Horses too well groomed for the rough terrain they'd crossed. Caleb spotted them first from the ridge above the house and was down at a dead run before they'd cleared the lower pasture. "Company," he said, breathless, bursting into the kitchen where Elara stood kneading dough beside Levi. The easy domestic scene of months of practice. 6 riders, one of them's no rancher, dressed like he stepped out of a Boston parlor. Elara's hands went still in the dough. She knew, before she even crossed to the window, exactly who had finally caught up to her. Sterling Vance rode at the head of the small procession, dressed in a tailored coat entirely wrong for mountain country, flanked by 5 hired men whose posture and bearing marked them clearly as Pinkerton agents rather than honest cowhands. He dismounted at the edge of the yard with the easy entitlement of a man who had never once doubted his right to be anywhere he chose to be. "Elara, my dear," he called out, voice carrying across the yard with practiced warmth that didn't reach his eyes. What a relief. "I've been searching for months." Gideon stepped out onto the porch first, Levi and Caleb fanning out behind him, none of them touching weapons yet, but all of them positioned with the easy readiness of men who knew exactly how fast that could change. "This is private land, mister," Gideon said evenly. "State your business plain or get back on your horse." Sterling's smile didn't waver, though something colder moved behind his eyes at being addressed. He clearly believed his bearing demanded. "My business is my niece, who you and your brothers have been harboring under false pretenses for some months now." I have documentation, properly executed, declaring her unfit to manage her own affairs. I'm here to bring her home, where she can receive proper care. He produced a folded paper from his coat, holding it out as though its mere existence settled the matter entirely. Forged, Elara said, stepping out onto the porch herself now. Chin lifted, voice steadier than she would have believed possible 6 months ago. Signed by a doctor you bribed, based on an examination that never happened. Sterling's expression flickered, just briefly. The mask of concerned guardian, slipping enough to show the calculation underneath. Elara, you're not well. The mountain air has clearly affected your judgment. And these men have filled your head with these men, Elara said, cutting him off entirely, something in her voice carrying a weight that silenced even Sterling's practiced confidence for a moment. Taught me more about decency in 6 months than you managed in 8 years. I am not an asset on your ledger. Uncle, I am not a line item to be managed, or a problem to be institutionalized, or property to be reclaimed once it's grown valuable enough to bother retrieving. She walked forward to the edge of the porch steps, and though every old instinct still whispered caution, she found she no longer needed to obey that whisper the way she once had. I am a free woman, she said. The law does not grant you ownership of my mind, my soul, or my father's company, no matter how many doctors you pay to say otherwise. Sterling's jaw tightened, the genteel mask cracking further. The law, my dear, currently grants me guardianship until you reach 25 or marry, whichever comes first. You are neither married nor of age. I have every legal right to escort you home, with or without your cooperation. She's not going anywhere she doesn't choose to go, Gideon said, voice flat and final, stepping slightly forward, his brothers moving with him like a single unit, long practiced in standing together. Sterling's eyes swept over the three brothers with open contempt. Frontier savages playing protector to a fortune they hope to claim for themselves. No doubt. Don't imagine I don't see exactly what this arrangement is. 3 men, 1 vulnerable young woman, conveniently isolated from any civilized authority who might ask uncomfortable questions. The accusation hung in the air, ugly and deliberate, designed to wound. But Elara only laughed, short and sharp, entirely without humor. Vulnerable, she repeated. You spent 8 years teaching me that word so I'd believe it described me. It doesn't. It never did. It described the cage you built and called concern. Sterling's hired men shifted uneasily, exchanging glances, the kind of men paid well for simple tasks. Now realizing this particular task had grown considerably more complicated than dragging home a frightened girl. I have documentation, Sterling said again, though his confidence had begun visibly fraying at the edges. I have the legal authority to compel. You have a forged document and 5 men paid to ignore how thin that paper actually is, Gideon said. That might carry weight back east, where your money buys the judges along with the doctors. Out here, it's just paper. This isn't finished, Sterling said, swinging back up onto his horse with considerably less grace than he'd dismounted with. I'll return with proper authorities, real authorities, not whatever passes for law in this forsaken territory. You do that, Gideon said evenly, and we'll be standing right here, same as we are now when you do. Sterling wheeled his horse and rode out at the head of his hired men, his fine coat looking increasingly out of place against the rough mountain trail, and the yard fell quiet behind him, the only sound the wind moving through new spring grass. Elara stood very still on the porch steps, watching the riders shrink into the distance, her hands trembling slightly, now that the confrontation had passed and left room for the fear to catch up to her at last. He'll come back, she said quietly, with actual lawmen this time, or with men he's paid to look like lawmen. He won't stop. Stopping isn't something he knows how to do. Then we'll be ready when he does, Caleb said simply, coming to stand beside her. Careful as always to leave space until she leaned into it herself, which she did now, grateful for the solid warmth of him beside her. Levi nodded toward the trail Sterling had taken. Man like that measures his worth by what he controls. Losing you wounds him worse than any rifle ever could. He'll be back, sure enough, but he'll be coming into country he doesn't understand. Against people who've already decided what they're willing to lose to keep you safe. Gideon turned to face her directly. Something steady and certain in his expression. You stood up to him just now without a single one of us saying a word for you, he said. Whatever comes next, remember that. You're not the Trembling girl who got off that train. Whatever he tries, he's not coming for her anymore. He's coming for the woman standing right here. Elara looked down at her own hands, steadier now than they'd been minutes ago, and found, beneath the fear still humming in her chest, something else entirely, something that felt, after 8 long years, remarkably like her own strength, finally standing in plain daylight, where nobody could talk her back into hiding it again. Let him come, she said. Sterling Vance did not return with lawmen. He returned, 3 days later, with 8 armed men and a temper sharpened by humiliation, riding hard up the canyon trail that cut through the eastern edge of Crossland. Caleb spotted the dust first, same as before, but this time there was no mistaking the intent behind it. Men riding in a loose line like that, rifles visible across their saddles, weren't coming to negotiate. They're taking the canyon trail, Caleb said, already moving toward the horses. Means they mean to come up fast and quiet. Catch us before we've got time to think. Then we won't give them the fight on their terms, Gideon said. We know that canyon better than any hired gun from back east ever could. Let's make that count for something. The plan came together quick. The kind of unspoken coordination that comes from 3 brothers who'd hunted that mountain together their whole lives. Gideon and Caleb rode out ahead, splitting off into the rocks above the narrowest stretch of the canyon, where the walls rose steep on both sides and the trail below pinched down to barely the width of 2 riders abreast. Levi stayed back at the house with Elara, every instinct in him screaming to be out there beside his brothers. But somebody needed to stand between the house and whatever came through, if the ambush failed entirely. I'm not staying behind a closed door, Elara said, already reaching for the Winchester rifle that had hung by the doorway for months now, the one Caleb had spent long afternoons teaching her to load, aim, and fire with steady, patient hands. Not while Gideon and Caleb ride into that canyon for me. Levi hesitated, torn between his instinct to protect her and the plain fact that she had earned the right to make this choice herself. You stay behind me, he said finally, and you do exactly as I say the moment things turn dangerous. Promise me that much, I promise, she said, and meant it. Though her hands were already steady around the rifle in a way they wouldn't have been 6 months earlier, they rode out together toward the canyon's mouth, careful to stay back from the worst of it, close enough to help if help was needed. Sterling's men entered the canyon at a hard trot, confident in their numbers, confident in the simple math of 8 armed men against 3 ranchers and a girl. That confidence lasted exactly as long as it took Gideon to call out from the rocks above. That's far enough. The riders below pulled up short, rifles swinging upward, searching the canyon walls for targets that had already tucked themselves carefully out of any clean line of fire. Show yourself. Cross, Sterling called out, his own horse stamping nervously beneath him, sensing the tension in the canyon air. Or are you the kind of man who hides in rocks rather than face me plain? Plenty plain enough from up here, Gideon called back. Turn around and ride home. Vance, save your men the trouble of finding out what it costs to keep coming. Sterling's jaw set, stubborn pride overriding whatever good sense he might have had left. Take the canyon, he barked at his men. They're bluffing. 3 men against 8. They've got no choice but to bluff. The hired men advanced, and Caleb's rifle cracked once, deliberately wide, kicking up dirt just ahead of the lead rider's horse. The animal reared, throwing its rider into the scrub, and the rest of the line scattered into a ragged tangle of spooked horses and shouting men. Next shot won't miss on purpose, Caleb called down, voice carrying flat and certain across the canyon. Last warning any of you get. A few of the hired men. Men paid well enough to fight, but not paid enough to die for somebody else's grudge. Exchanged uneasy glances and began backing their horses toward the canyon mouth entirely. Sterling, watching his hired strength evaporate around him. Grew desperate in the particular way that desperate men often did, which was to say, dangerous. He raised his own rifle, sighting up the canyon wall toward where Gideon had shifted position to get a better angle. And in that single narrow moment, with Gideon's back partially exposed as he moved across an open stretch of rock, Sterling's finger found the trigger. Elara saw it from where she sat astride her horse at the canyon's edge, the angle giving her a clear line nobody else had. There wasn't time to shout, a warning that would reach Gideon before the shot. There was only time to act. Her eyes found the heavy deadwood branch hanging directly above Sterling's horse, half broken already from the winter's weight of snow, hanging by little more than splintered fiber and stubbornness. She raised her own rifle, the one Caleb had taught her to hold steady, to breathe slow, to trust her own aim rather than fight it. She fired. The branch cracked free with a sound like a gunshot itself, crashing down directly onto the startled horse beneath Sterling, who tumbled sideways out of his saddle with an undignified shout. The crash and the falling debris triggered a small slide of loose rock and snow from the canyon wall above, enough to send every remaining horse into a panicked, scattering frenzy. In the chaos, rifles were dropped, horses bolted, and Sterling's carefully assembled force dissolved into men, scrambling simply to avoid being trampled by their own mounts. Gideon, his moment of vulnerability passed entirely, without him even realizing how close it had come, turned to see the source of the rock slide, and found Elara still astride her horse at the canyon's edge, rifle lowered now, breathing hard but steady. "You saved my life just now," he said later, once the dust had settled, and Sterling's remaining men had fled the canyon entirely, leaving their employers stranded and furious in the dirt, without a single shot aimed to kill anybody. "I didn't need to kill anybody," Elara said simply, dismounting, her legs slightly unsteady, now that the urgency had passed and left room for the shaking to catch up. "I just needed to stop him before he killed you." "Where'd you learn to shoot a branch clean off a tree at that distance?" Caleb asked, genuine admiration in his voice, as he climbed down from the rocks above. "You taught me," Elara said. "Patient, steady breathe before you pull the trigger. I just found a use for it you probably didn't expect." Sterling, dragged from beneath the fallen branch by what remained of his loyal men, looked considerably less impressive, covered in mud and pine needles, than he had looked. Riding up the trail 3 days earlier, his fine coat was torn. His dignity, what little of it had survived the encounter, was in considerably worse shape. "This isn't over," he spat, struggling upright. "I'll have you all arrested. Kidnapping. Assault. I'll see every one of you in irons before the year's out." "You're welcome to try," Gideon said, stepping down from the rocks to stand level with him, towering over the man, despite Sterling's considerable wealth and self-regard. "Same as you're welcome to explain to any honest judge exactly why a wealthy Eastern businessman rode 8 armed men into Montana territory to kidnap his own niece against her clearly stated wishes." Sterling had no answer for that, not one that wouldn't damn him further, and he retreated down the canyon trail on a borrowed horse, trailed by the handful of men who hadn't already fled, leaving behind only the echo of his threats and the settling dust of his failed ambush. Elara watched him go, rifle still loose in her hands, and found that the fear she'd expected to feel, watching her uncle ride away defeated, had been replaced almost entirely by something steadier. Not triumph, exactly. Something closer to simple, solid certainty that she had stopped being prey the moment she'd stopped believing herself to be. "He'll try the law next," she said quietly. "Money buys judges back east. He'll find a way to make this look like kidnapping. Somehow, no matter how it actually happened." Gideon nodded slowly, watching the dust settle over the canyon trail. "Then we'll meet him in town when he tries it," he said. "Same as we met him here. Whatever ground he picks to fight on next, he'll find we're not nearly as easy to corner as he thinks." Sterling, true to his nature, did not give up so easily. 3 weeks after the canyon standoff, word reached the ranch that he had taken up residence at the town hotel. his pockets considerably deeper than the local sheriff's salary, and had spent his time there cultivating exactly the kind of relationship that money tended to cultivate in places where the law answered to whoever paid it best. The summons came on a quiet Tuesday morning. Sheriff Dunlap himself rode out to the ranch, looking uncomfortable in a way that suggested he understood exactly how thin his own justification really was. "Got a warrant," he said, not quite meeting Gideon's eyes as he produced the paper. "Kidnapping charges. Says you three took this woman against her will and have kept her isolated out here ever since." "That's a lie, and you know it," Levi said, stepping forward, his usual gentleness replaced by something harder around the edges. "Don't matter what I know," Dunlap said, shame coloring his voice, even as he held his ground. "Judge Halloran's already agreed to hear it this afternoon, on account of Mr. Vance's testimony and his documentation. I'm obliged to bring you all in." It was, Elara realized as she rode into town flanked by the three brothers, exactly the trap Sterling had been building from the moment his canyon ambush failed. He hadn't needed force to win. He'd simply needed a corrupt enough judge and enough money to make the law itself into a weapon. The same weapon he'd already tried to use against her once before with his forged medical documents. The town square had filled by the time they arrived, word having spread fast through a community small enough that everybody generally knew everybody else's business within hours. Judge Halloran sat behind a makeshift bench set up on the courthouse steps, looking entirely too comfortable with the arrangement Sterling had clearly paid handsomely to construct. Sterling himself stood nearby, freshly dressed, every trace of the canyon ambush's humiliation carefully scrubbed away, presenting himself once again as the concerned. "Wrong guardian, Your Honor," Sterling began, voice pitched for maximum sympathy. "These three men lured my niece west under false pretenses, isolated her from civilized society, and have kept her against her will through fear and manipulation. I ask that she be returned to my custody immediately, and that these men face appropriate charges for their crimes." "That's a lie," Elara said clearly, stepping forward before anyone could stop her. "I came west of my own choosing. I have stayed of my own choosing. Nothing about my time on the Cross Ranch has involved fear or manipulation, save what my uncle himself has tried to manufacture from 300 miles away." Judge Halloran's expression remained carefully neutral, the practiced neutrality of a man who had already decided which way he intended to rule and was simply waiting for the appropriate moment to announce it. "A young woman's perception of her own situation can be unreliable, particularly under duress," he said smoothly. "Mr. Vance's documentation suggests his documentation is forged," Gideon interrupted. "Same forged paperwork he tried to use against her before, declaring her unfit to manage her own affairs. Ask him to produce the doctor who supposedly examined her. Ask that doctor to testify under oath in front of this whole town, exactly when and where that examination took place." A murmur moved through the gathered crowd, and Sterling's confidence flickered, just slightly. The kind of crack that came from a man realizing his lies might not survive close inspection in a town where everybody was watching. It was at that moment, as Judge Halloran shifted in his seat, clearly searching for some way to steer the proceeding back toward its predetermined conclusion, that the crowd itself began to move. Doc Hadley, the town's actual physician, who had stitched up half the ranches in the valley over the years and delivered most of the children born in the last decade, stepped forward first. Beside him came Mrs. Abernathy, whose husband's leg the Cross brothers had set after a bad fall 2 winters back, free of charge, the way the brothers handled most of their dealings with neighbors who couldn't always pay in coin. Then came the children, a dozen of them more, sons and daughters of ranching families scattered across the valley, who had spent their afternoons over the past several months gathered around Elara's kitchen table, learning their letters, since the nearest schoolhouse sat a full day's ride from most of their homes, and she had simply started teaching them herself, without asking anyone's permission, the same way she'd started doing most things since arriving on the Cross Ranch, one by one, then in a steady wave. The townspeople moved to stand between the makeshift bench and the Cross family, rifles raised in silent, unmistakable solidarity, forming a wall that no forged document and no bribed judge could simply order aside. Doc Hadley spoke first, his voice carrying clear across the suddenly silent square. "Mr. Vance," he said, "money might buy you a judge back east, might even buy you one out here, given enough of it, but it doesn't buy you the truth, and it sure doesn't buy you the loyalty of folks who've actually lived alongside the people you're slandering. You have no jurisdiction over free people," he continued, "no matter how many documents you wave around. A man's worth out here gets measured by how he treats his neighbors, not by the size of his bank account back east. The Cross brothers have treated this whole valley with nothing but decency since before any of us can remember. This woman has taught half our children their letters without asking a single penny in return. You rode in here 3 weeks back with hired guns and forged papers, and you've got the gall to stand there now and call yourself the wronged party." Judge Halloran, faced with a town square full of armed, united citizens, and the increasingly obvious thinness of Sterling's case, found his earlier confidence evaporating fast. A judge's authority, however well purchased, generally required at least the appearance of a community willing to enforce it. This community had just made its position unmistakably clear. "I find," Halloran said, voice considerably less certain than it had been minutes earlier, "that the charges lack sufficient evidence to proceed. Case dismissed." Sterling's face went through several colors in quick succession, fury and humiliation warring for dominance, before he finally turned on Elara with what little dignity he had left. "This isn't finished," he said, voice low and venomous. "I'll find another judge, another county. You can't hide behind these people forever." "I'm not hiding," Elara said. "I'm standing exactly where I choose to stand, among people who actually know me, rather than people who only ever saw a ledger entry where a niece should have been." She held his gaze steady. No trace of the Trembling girl from the train platform left in her bearing at all. "Go home, Uncle. There's nothing left here for you to claim." It was the U.S. Marshal's office. Alerted by a quietly persistent letter from Doc Hadley detailing the forged medical documentation and the attempted bribery of a sitting judge, that finally settled the matter for good 2 weeks later. Sterling Vance left Montana Territory under federal escort, facing charges of fraud and attempted bribery that would occupy considerably more of his attention than any further pursuit of his niece's inheritance. The valley, and the ranch beneath White Wolf Peak, settled back into its quiet rhythms. Finally, truly, free of the shadow that had followed Elara across half a continent, summer arrived full and golden across the valley. The kind of season that made a person forget entirely how brutal the winters could be. The ranch hummed with easy, settled activity, Levi's small veterinary practice having grown steadily as word spread of his gentle, capable hands. Caleb spending his days ranging the high country he loved best, and Elara's little kitchen schoolhouse now boasting nearly 20 regular students. Several families having begun contributing what they could toward proper books and slates. It was a quiet evening in late summer when Gideon found Elara walking the ridge trail above the house, the one that looked out over the whole sweep of the valley. Gold light pooling in the low places where the creek wound through summer grass. He fell into step beside her, without a word, the comfortable kind of silence that had grown between them over the past months, built slowly from shared mornings and hard winters, and the particular trust that comes from a person who has proven repeatedly exactly who they are when it matters most. They reached the cliff's edge together, the whole valley spread out below them in the fading light. And Gideon, out of an old habit she had come to recognize and even treasure, looked down at the dirt beneath his boots. He drew a line with the toe of his boot, the same careful gesture he'd made with charcoal on an attic floor nearly a year earlier, preparing, as he always did without needing to think about it anymore, to step back the moment the line was drawn. Elara didn't let him. She stepped forward instead. deliberately, and scuffed the line away entirely with her own boot, the dirt scattering into nothing. No boundary left between them at all. Gideon looked up, startled, something cautiously hopeful moving behind his river ice eyes. "You don't need to give me 10 inches anymore, Gideon," she said softly, closing the remaining distance between them entirely, until she stood close enough to feel the warmth of him, close enough to rest her palm flat against his chest, right over the steady, certain beat of his heart. "Not tonight, not ever again, if you'll have it that way." Elara, her name came out rough, careful, like a man almost afraid to believe what was happening in front of him. "I spent 8 years believing my body, and my choices belonged to somebody else," she said. "You and your brothers spent a whole winter, and a whole spring, and a whole summer teaching me otherwise, one patient lesson at a time. Levi taught me my hands were my own to use as I saw fit. Caleb taught me my strength was nothing to apologize for. And you," her hand pressed gently against his chest, feeling his heartbeat quicken slightly beneath her palm. "You taught me that real safety isn't about being caged away from danger. It's about choosing, freely, who gets close enough to matter." "And what have you chosen?" Gideon asked, voice barely above a whisper now, the whole valley holding its breath around them in the gold evening light. "You," she said simply. "I want to give you the rest of my life, Gideon Cross, not because I have nowhere else to go, because there's nowhere else I'd rather be." He closed the last small distance between them himself then, slow and certain, giving her every chance to step back if she wished. The same careful respect he'd shown her from the very first night. She didn't step back. She rose to meet him instead, and the kiss that followed carried the whole long journey between them. Every careful boundary, every patient lesson, every hard-won inch of trust folded into something neither of them had any further need to measure. They married before the first snow returned to White Wolf Peak, the whole valley turning out for the occasion. Doc, Hadley, and Mrs. Abernathy, and a dozen children Elara had taught their letters all crowded into the little church that had somehow, over the past year, become as much her community as the family she'd married into. The years that followed unfolded exactly as steady and good as the foundation that had been laid. Levi's veterinary practice grew into the finest in the territory, ranchers riding 2 days just to bring him their most difficult cases, his gentle hands as sure with people. Eventually, as they'd always been with animals, Caleb took up work as the valley's first forest ranger, his quiet knowledge of the mountain finally given an official purpose, though he never did lose the habit of teaching every young person who asked how to read a trail or split a log clean through. And Elara, once a trembling girl who had arrived on a frozen train platform, believing herself trapped no matter which direction she turned, used her finally secured inheritance to build a proper schoolhouse in town. Real walls and real books, and a teacher's salary that didn't depend on charity or goodwill. A plaque above the door read simply, "The Vance Cross School, founded so that every child, regardless of birth or circumstance, might know the full measure of their own worth." Standing on the schoolhouse steps some years later, watching a new class of children file through doors she'd built with her own hard-won fortune, Elara sometimes thought back to that frozen platform. 3 terrifying strangers, and a single charcoal line drawn careful and patient across an attic floor. It had never really been a boundary at all. She understood now. It had been an invitation, offered freely to walk toward freedom at exactly the pace her own healing required. She had taken her time, and in the end, that had made all the difference. The characters, settings, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional. While certain themes may echo real-life experiences, they are shaped by creative interpretation. The author does not intend to represent or depict any specific individual, organization, or historical event. And so beneath the shadow of White Wolf Peak, Elara's story comes to an end not with a gunshot, not with revenge, and not with a woman being rescued by men stronger than herself. It ends with something far quieter and far more powerful, a woman learning that she was never broken beyond repair. When Elara first stepped off that train, she believed fear was the only thing waiting for her. She had run from a life where love had been replaced by control, where protection had been used as another word for ownership, and where her own voice had been buried beneath other people's greed. But on that lonely Montana platform, she did not find another cage. She found three brothers who understood that real strength does not demand trust. It earns it patiently, one day at a time. Gideon's charcoal line across the floor may have seemed like a small gesture, only 10 inches of space between danger and safety. But in truth, it became the heart of the whole story. That line taught Elara that boundaries are not walls built to keep love out. Sometimes, they are the first doorway back to freedom. Levi taught her that care is not charity, and that a person's worth is not measured by how much they can endure in silence. Caleb taught her that strength in a woman is not something to be feared, mocked, or hidden away. And Gideon taught her that safety is not found in being locked away from the world, but in being allowed to choose who may stand beside you when the world turns cruel. This story reminds us that healing is rarely sudden. It does not arrive all at once like sunrise over the mountains. It comes in small moments, a meal shared at the same table, a hand offered without pressure, a lesson taught without judgment, a line drawn and respected until the wounded heart is ready to step across it. Elara's courage was not born in the canyon, or the courtroom, or the moment she faced Sterling Vance. It began much earlier, in the quiet decision to keep waking up, keep learning, keep trusting just a little more than the day before. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson this tale gives us. True love does not erase fear by force. It waits beside fear until the person carrying it is ready to set it down. The Cross brothers never saved Elara by taking her choices away. They saved her by giving them back. And once she had those choices again, she became more than someone who survived. She became a woman who could teach children, protect the people she loved, stand before corrupt power, and say with a steady voice, "I belong to myself." For every listener who has ever felt trapped by the past, by shame, by someone else's cruelty, or by the belief that they are too damaged to begin again, Elara's journey carries a simple but lasting truth. You are not what happened to you. You are not the fear someone planted in your chest. You are not the cage they built around your name. You are the person who still has the right to heal, to love, and to walk into a future that is yours. In the end, White Wolf Peak did not give Elara an easy life. It gave her an honest one. A life built on respect, patience, courage, and the kind of love that never needs to control in order to be strong. And that is why this story matters. Because out on that wild frontier, where winter could bury a valley and greed could ride in wearing a fine coat, the greatest victory was not won with bullets or money. It was won with decency. It was won with trust. It was won when one frightened young woman finally understood that freedom was not a place on a map. Freedom was the moment she stopped asking permission to be whole.